Boker Tov. We're going to start today's Daf Yomi on the top of Zion Amad Aleph, on the top of Kesubos, Daf Zion. And the Gemara is discussing whether or not you're allowed to have the initial Bia on Shabbos, that there was when it's a virgin. There was a dispute about this between Rav and Shmuel. And in each place where they studied, Rav's academy said Rav said was lenient, and Shmuel's academy said Shmuel said was lenient. So we're going to take up this discussion on 7a at the top. Rabbi Ami Shari L'mivo B'tchila B'Shabbos. Rabbi Ami allowed the initial Bia to take place on Shabbos, on Friday night. So Amalei Rabbanan, so the Rabbanan said to Rabbi Ami, but there's another problem, aside from the problems we were discussing. You're making a wound, or so that was one issue. And you're mitaking, or we discussed all this, whether it was pocket or akir or mechubar. All these situations, aside from that, there's another problem. V'alo ksiva ksuvasa. Where is her ksuva? You have to write, a man is not allowed to be married to a woman. He's not allowed to remain married without writing the ksuva. And so therefore, if a person has a relationship with her without giving her a ksuva, what's a ksuva? A ksuva is a bond that the husband gives to the bride. And so therefore, how is he able to have the initial bia with her on Shabbos if he can't write for her a ksuva? So that's the question. Amaro itfasua metaltlin. So the response that the rabbis gave to that was that give her metaltlin. So basically, in this situation, he said you could go together and be together on Friday night, but he didn't yet have the time to write the ksuba for her. So how are they going to be together without him writing the ksuba for her? So he said, "Itfasua metaltlin, give her some movable objects as a mashkon, as a collateral for shibud ksuvasa," meaning to say, give her something to hold on to until such time as you're able to write her a ksuba afterwards. And this will be, and the ksuba will be mortgaged to real estate. But until such time as you can do the real estate, give her the metaltlin. The Rishonim have a big discussion. How are you able to give her something on Shabbos? So some say because maybe it was for a mitzvah for this purpose. That's one of the three suggestions the Rashba says. And maybe because it was a mitzvah, you're allowed to give it to her, the metaltlin, as in place of the ksuba for Shabbos. Rav Zvid Shari L'mival B'tchila B'Shabbos. Rav Zvid also allowed the initial bia to take place on Shabbos. Ika da Amri, some say Rav Zvid Gufei Baal B'sula B'Shabbos. Some say Rav Zvid himself had his initial bia with his besula on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Shari L'mival B'tchila B'Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda allowed the initial bia to take place also on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, "Amar Papa Mishmei D'Rava Lo Tema B'Yom Tov Shari Haba Shabbos." So don't say that from the fact that he had the initial bia on Yom Tov, that means on Yom Tov it's permitted, but on Shabbos it's prohibited. Don't say that. Don't say that. That's what he's saying. Do I dim b'Shabbos? Do I feel b'Shabbos? Not mishari. Even on Shabbos, according to Rav Yehuda, it would be permitted to have the initial bia even on Shabbos. But what Rav Yehuda was allowing was actually in that incident where they got married on, and the first bia would be on Yom Tov. He allowed it. Rav Papa Mishmei D'Rava Amar B'Yom Tov Shari B'Shabbos Aser. Rav Papa disagrees. He says in Yom Tov the first bia is permitted, but on Shabbos it's prohibited. So Amalei Rav Papa my daitech. So Rav Papi says to Rav Papa, what's your thinking when you're saying that on Yom Tov it's permitted, but on Shabbos it's prohibited? Is your logic, and this takes us back to some of the discussions we had in Maseches Beitza, is your logic because you're allowed to make a wound on Yom Tov for the purposes of what's called ochel nefesh, for the purpose of eating, like shchita. So therefore, it's permitted even not for the purpose of eating, like when a husband is with a bride on the wedding night, he makes the wound. Is that your logic, Al Me'ata? If that's your case, if that's your argument, Musar la'asos mugmar b'yom tov mitoch she'otra avaro tzarach tzarach otra na mishalo tzarach. It should also be permitted to make, like they used to burn some spices and make a fragrance to like perfume the clothes, like basically like dry cleaning the clothes, because they didn't have a way to make them smell good, that this is the way they made them smell good. So if you're allowed to, since you're saying this concept of mitoch, because something is allowed for the purpose of ochel nefesh, of eating a yontif, it's also allowed, even when you're not using it for eating, you should be also allowed to make fragrances on yontif, because just like you can make a fire for the purpose of eating, you could also make a fire not for the purpose of eating. So in this case, Rav Papa responds to Rav Papi, no, that's why there's the verse, that's something that will be eaten by everyone, means to say, davar hashava kol nefesh. It has to be something that is everybody wants, that's permitted. And Rashi says, be'ilu hashava kol, the intercourse is something that everybody is interested in, but mugmar, but spices, but fragrances, that's only the people, the fancy people, send their clothes out to the dry cleaners. But the regular people just say, I'll do it at home. I don't need the fragrances. So I'm away Rav Acha, Brei de Rava or Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha, Brei de Rava says to Rav Ashi, El Me'ata, and his Damil Tzvi, Biyom Tov, Hol Veinu Shavah Kol Nefesh, Achinami Da'asur. If that's the case, says Rav Acha Brei de Rava to Rav Ashi, if that's the case, if you got venison on Yontif, would you say that because it's not Shavah Kol Nefesh, because it's not something that everybody eats, not everybody eats from venison, would you say that it's asur l'mishlote? Would you say it's prohibited to slaughter it on Yontif? Because not everybody's going to eat it. So he responds, he said, I said that it would be something that is not that everybody wants, but something that everybody needs. And the venison is something that everybody needs, because it's food, and so therefore it's something that there's a tzarach for it. Meaning to say, even though it's not common for people to eat because it's so expensive, but it is something that's needed. The food is needed, as opposed to the fragrances in the garments. Only the anash mefunakim, only the people who are the mefunaks, only those people who are the especially fancy people, they're the only ones who need it or who want it. So Amar Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi. He says Rabbi Yochanan says you're not allowed to have the initial intercourse on Friday night. So the Gemara says he gave a hurrah saying that it is prohibited. But the Gemara says, Umi ika hurrah isur. Do we really call the word hurrah? Would we be using this word if it was going to be prohibited? Because Rashi explains, and this is a fundamental distinction between prohibiting something and permitting something. It's a lot greater to be able to permit something than to prohibit something. Rashi explains, everybody could be strict on their own. One who prohibits it, it's not an indication of anything. Even if there's a doubt, if he's not certain, he'll come and prohibit something. But somebody who allows something, so he's going to rely upon what he heard, his teaching, or on his logic of his wisdom. That's called a horah. To prohibit something, that's not a horah. But to allow something, that's called a horah. So when Rabbi Yochanan prohibits the being together on Friday night for the first night, why would we call that a horah? That's not a horah. So the Gemara says, do we call a horah to prohibit something? The Gemara says, yes, indeed we do. But Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah in Nazir, Horua Beis Hillel Shetei Nazira Od Sheva Shanim Acheros. Beis Hillel ruled that in a situation where we have this Mesechas Nazir with Queen Helena, that we had a situation with Queen Helena, Mesechas Nazir, so that her son went out to war and she made a vow that she was going to be a Nazir for 7 years. But she made this vow outside the land of Israel, and then she went into the land of Israel. So then Beis Hillel made a rule that she has to be a Nazirite for another 7 years. So we see from here that we use the word horua also to be strict. Horua beis hillel shektin nizira od sheva shana machiros. V'inami, or alternatively, ki hadatanya. We have another example. Ki hadatanya chut hashidra shenivsach berubo. Let's say you have the spinal cord, that the majority of it was severed. The majority of the spinal cord was severed. So we say that that's a treifa, Divrei Rebbe Yaakov. And they were, so Divrei Rebbe, whereas Rebbe Yaakov says, I feel nikev, even if the spinal cord has a puncture in it, Hora Rebbe ke Rebbe Yaakov. But Rebbe Yaakov said, I feel nikev, and then Hora Rebbe ke Rebbe Yaakov. And then Rebbe ruled like Rebbe Yaakov, that even if it has a puncture in it. So we see that a Hora is here to be prohibited. So Amar Rav Huna, Ena Olacha ke Rabbi Yaakov. Rav Huna said the law is not like Rabbi Yaakov, who says that even if it's punctured, it's a treifa. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Masni Hachi. He taught like this. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Rav Huna, Shal Rabbi Shmuel ben Yaakov the Minsur as Rabbi Yochanan b'Tzidan v'ani Shami. And I heard it. Ma'u levol b'tchil b'Shabbos v'Amar lei Aser. Rabbi Yochanan said, you now have the initial consummation on Friday night. But in the end, we rule that it is permitted to have the initial bia on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Chalbo, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zabda, Amar Rabbi Acha, Besua, Achas Besua, v'Achas Almana Te'una Bracha. Now, whether one is a Besua, whether one is at a wedding of a Besua, of a virgin, or an Almana. Almana doesn't necessarily mean here a widow. It can mean anybody who's not a widow, who's not a virgin. To una bracha, they require the blessing. And what blessing is this? Rashi says, Birchas Chatanim, the blessing of the groom. There are other possibilities of what this could be. There's a blessing that I opened a nut. That's one blessing, but here it's referring to not a blessing that the groom makes on being with the bride, but it's referring to a blessing, what we call the Sheva Brachos today, the 7 blessings. That's the way most understand it. But technically speaking, if we just read the literal Gemara, it might have been referring to something else, what the blessing is. The Gemara says, Umi Amar Rav Huna, does Rav Huna really say that you require these Berchas Chatanim? Amar Rav Huna, Almana Eina Tuna Bracha, that the Almana, the non-virgin, does not require the blessing. So the Gemara says, Lo Kasha, if it was an unmarried man who married almana, they would require a blessing. But if it's a widower who married a widow, then there would be no berchas chasanim. Gemara says the question: if a widower marries a widow, do they not really require berchas chasanim? Tana, we learn minayim berchas chasanim ba'asara. He says, how do we know that the berchas chasanim require, that the bracha chasanim requires 10, requires a minyan, as it states, Vayikach asara anashim miziknei ha'ir. Boaz in the book of Ruth, it says when he wants to marry Ruth, it says he takes 10 men. Vayikach asara anashim miziknei ha'ir. He takes 10 men from the elders of the city. Vayomer shvu po, and he says, remain here. Vayeshvu, vayeshvu. And they remained there. Uboaz vayeshevu, and they remained there. Boaz almon shenas almana have, and Boaz, we know that the rabbis tell us, it doesn't say in the book of Ruth. We know that Boaz was a widower because it says in the Gemara in Baba Basra, that Iv's son was Boaz, and he already had 30 sons and 30 daughters. And then Boaz was punished because he didn't invite Shimshon's father to the wedding. But anyway, we see from here that Boaz was a widower who married a widow. And so nevertheless, they had a Sheva Brachos with a minyan. So how can you say that they do not, if it's a widow or marries a widow, they don't require a blessing? So my ina tuna bracha, the amrafuna, ina tuna bracha kol zayin. They don't need blessings for all 7 days of a yom echad tuna bracha, but they require a blessing the first day. Where it says, well, al-hadatanya shaktu chachamim al takanas benos Yisrael she'esameach ima gimel yomim b'mai. Well, what about when the rabbi said that which we said a couple of days ago, that the rabbis were diligent, shaktu, they made a takana, that the benos Yisrael, They had to be rejoicing with each other for 3 days. What's that referring to? If it's with a young man who's getting married, Amr Shiva, you said that you require 7 days. So it can't be that this is just a bachor who's marrying. So an iba almon, and if it's a widow, amras yom echad. You said 1 day. So where do we see this idea that you have to be rejoicing for 3 days? You could say we're talking about a widower, and yom echad bracha simple. Yeah, we only make the birchas chatana for 1 day, but we make 3 days of rejoicing. Or you could say it's referring to the bachor. And we say shiva bracha shlosho simple. You need 7 days for the blessing, but 3 days of rejoicing where you're supposed to remain with her and be rejoicing. So the Gemara challenges this idea that the bachor that marries the widow, that you make the birchas chatanim for all 7 days. The Gemara challenges this because what does it say on top of Zayin Amabeis? Neismei mevarchel absua shiva. It says that you make a blessing for Basua. So you make a blessing for Basua for 7 days and for a widow for 1 day. So, my love, aren't we referring to in this case that even if it's a widow who marries the bachor, that you're supposed to make this blessing for 7 days? The Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. Well, we're talking about almon. We're talking about a widower. That's where the blessing is. Where the widower marries the widow, you make the blessing for 1 day. Avol bachar mai sheva. If the bachar marries the widow, it is a blessing of 7 days of blessings. Listening, if that's the case, in the first part of the brayso, it should say shiva shiva. You should have said at the beginning of the brayso the virgin gets 7, and the widow who marries a bachar also has a blessing for 7 days. And for a regular widow, you just get 1 day. So the Gemara says, no, milsa psikta katani. So the answer is, they taught us a straight law. They taught us a straight halacha. What was the straight halacha? Deleka besua debatzar mishiva. Because they said there's never a case of where a widow, a virgin has less than 7 days. V'leika almana, and there's never a case of a widow. There's never a case of a widow who has less than 1 day. So they want to teach the straight out halachot that don't need any coincidence. That a virgin girl always gets a minimum of 7 days, and a widow gets always a minimum of 1 day, but she could sometimes get more. So therefore, the Gemara analyzes this case. Kufa Amar Rav Nachman Amar Yehuna bar Nasan. Tana, we learned Minayla Berchas Chatana Basara. What's the source of this idea that the Birchas Chatanim requires a minyan? As it states, Vayikach Asaran Hashem Miziknei Ha'ir. We cite the verse from Boaz. He took 10 men from the elders of the city. Vayomer Shvupo, and he said to remain here. And so therefore, Boaz told these 10 men to remain here. Rabbi Abo Amakor. Rabbi Abo has a different verse. What's a different verse? B'makalos Baruchu Elokim Hashem Mimikor Yisrael. B'makalos, in the gatherings, Baruchu Elokim, they blessed Elokim Hashem Mimikor Yisrael, from the source of Israel. What does that mean? Rashi explains. Al Birkas Mikor, for a blessing that comes from the source, meaning a blessing about the source. Sarach Kahal, you need a community. And V'hainu Asar, Rashi says, and this community is 10. How do we know? Gather up the people. So that's how, and we learned that from the gathering of the spies, which were 10. So that's Rabbi Avo's source. But Makelos Barchul Kim Hashem Mikor Yisrael. The Mikor refers to a wedding. And that's how you require the minimum of 10. The Gemara says, Rav Nachman Ba'ai Krad Rabbi Avohu. Rav Nachman, who cites the verse from the book of Ruth. What does he do with the pasuk of Rabbi Avo? Rabbi Avo cites the concept of the makilos. So what does Rav Nachman do with that? So the Gemara says, he uses the following. How do we know that? How do we know that even the fetuses that were in their mother's wombs chanted praise by the sea? As it says, "B'makelos baruchu Elokim Hashem mimikor Yisrael." So there, the makor means from the womb, so that even the fetuses praise God from the womb. The idach and Rabbi Avo, what does he do with the pasuk from Rav Nachman of Ruth, where Boaz said, "Stay here"? Well, first of all, before we get to that, he says idach and Rabbi Avo. How does he know this idea of that the fetuses sing the praises of God by the splitting of the sea? Where does Rabbi Avo know that from? So he says, "Im kain le'makrami beten." The pasuk could have said from the beten, ma'am makor. So yes, Rabbi Meir is citing that pasuk, but it didn't need the word makor. It could have used the word beten, ma'am makor, to teach us something else, which is al iske makor. It's teaching us also that you need a minyan for the blessings of the Sheva Brachos at the wedding. Rabbi Avo b'hai kod Rav Nachman my darshbe. So what does Rabbi Avo do with this pasuk of Rav Nachman? Again, what did Rav Nachman use the pasuk for? He used the pasuk of Boaz, and where Boaz gathered the 10 elders of the city, and he said, "Stay here for the wedding." So that's the source for the fact that Ruth, that's the source of the idea that we need a minyan for the Berchas Chasana. So what does Rabbi Avo do with this pasuk? Midrash. No, he needed the 10 men there to make a drasha, which we saw in Yevamos several times. We saw in Yevamos Samach Tes and Aleph, that there it states, Amoni v'o Amonis, Moavi v'o Moadis. That it's to tell us that they needed the minyan there to make the bracha to make the drasha that you cannot. When it says you cannot marry an Ammonite in the Torah, it means a male Ammonite, not a female Ammonite. A male Moabite, not a female Moabite. Because says Rabbi Avo to Rabbi Nachman, if you want to say that the pasuk is only needed to make a bless, to teach us that you require 10 for a blessing. Most sagi allows a kingdom. They don't need to be elders. You don't need to say, you need 10 chashav rabbanim at the wedding. No, you just need any 10 Jews. In fact, some want to say that this type of 10 is different than a minyan. I saw this, somebody brought this down, that they wanted to attribute it to Rabbi Soloveitchik. I don't know if Rabbi Soloveitchik actually said this, but they said that there are certain times where you could have a kehila, which can be made up of 10, even though without actually 10 men, which for certain things, you maybe can need 10, even though they don't need to be specifically 10 men. It could be maybe counting women, for example. So the Gemara says, if you want to say that pasuk about Boaz and Ruth refers to a blessing, you don't need elders. So why does Rav Nachman say it needs to be elders? Whereas Rav Nachman responds, so Rav Nachman responds that why did he gather them specifically for elders? Because he said he'll say back, if you saying that what's the reason Boaz gathered the 10 just to make this vort about Ammoni and not Ammonis? You don't need 10 people to make a midrash. Why do you say specific? Well, you need 10 people to gather to teach us halacha about Ammoni and not a female Ammonite, and Moabi, not a female Ammonite. No, about that, Rabbi Avro has an answer. For Sumi Milsa, no, you need the 10 men there to publicize it, to be mefarsim this halacha, this chiddush that was being taught there. You need to have 10 men for that. Like Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagdata, Puk va'aisli be'asara. And this is another case which we had recently in Yevamos Samach Vavam and Alf, that Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagdata, he said, go bring for me 10 people, 10 men, the Emilcha ba'ampayu, and I will say to you in front of them, Amazaka ubar, that if somebody wants to acquire something on behalf of the fetus, kana, that is somebody saying, I'm giving something to you on behalf of the fetus, that the fetus is able to acquire it, even though he's not yet born. But then in the end, we learned that that's not the halacha. The fetus cannot acquire something formally until he's actually born. But so that's a second example of the hilchasa uprooting the last line of the Gemara on our daf. But anyway, we see from there that if you have a big chiddush, you should only be mefarsim, and you should only publicize in front of 10. Tanu Rabbanan Mevarchem Berchas Chatanim and Beis Chasanim. So the rabbis thought you should make the Berchas Chasanim. What we say the Sheva Brachos, you should do this in the Beis Chatanim, meaning during the wedding when you do the chuppah. Rabbi Yehuda says after Beis Erusin, even when you do the betrothal, even before the chuppah, you should make the Sheva Brachos. So you make these Berchas Chasanim. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shanu. And in this teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, they taught this only in Judea. Why? Because they had to practice with Nation Misyachadima. Because their custom was when they did the Erusin in Judea, then they would put them together, the bride and the groom, in seclusion in order for them to be used to each other. And so therefore, since we have the principle, a kala without a blessing is prohibited to her husband like a nita. So therefore, they needed to put the blessing during the time of the Erusin. Tanya Idach, alternative source says, Mevarchem Berchas Chasanim Beis Chasanim Berchas Erusin Beis Erusin. Know that you make the Berchas Chasanim, the 7 brachos, what we call the chuppah, we call Sheva brachos. You make them during the Berchas Chasanim at the chuppah, meaning to say Beis Chasanim, you make them under the chuppah. Berchas Erusin, and the blessing of the Erusin, which we do today also under the chuppah, you do that for Beis Erusin when you do the Kedushin. That's the bracha that we do the Erusin. This is the bracha I was zocha to make in France. Just what's today? Today is Wednesday. I made it on Monday afternoon, and I said exactly the same bracha, the exact same bracha that was in the Gemara 2,000 years ago. I said in France 2 days ago. The bracha didn't change. The Jewish people have been reciting this bracha. And why does the rabbi make the bracha? So some say, well, it's not a bracha on the groom specifically. It's a bracha on the occasion of giving grace to God, giving thanks to God. Alternatively, some say no, the practice became for the rabbi to say it, so as not to embarrass those grooms who don't know how to recite the blessing. So what's the bracha? Rav bar Rav Ada Rav Ada Travayu. They both said Mishmei Rav Yehuda Amri. God commanded us about the prohibited relationships, and also rabbinically we're prohibited to be with the betrothed women until they fully marry them. And allowed us to be with the married women through this concept of chuppah v'kiddushin. And this is the bracha that we say today. And he concludes it with the way we concluded today. God betroths, God sanctifies Israel through chuppah and kiddushin. Through chuppah, it really should be kiddushin the chuppah, but because chuppah comes after kiddushin. So that's a question that the Rishonim ask. Why does chuppah come before kiddushin? In the Sheoltos of Rabbi Chai, indeed he has that girsa. He puts it in the kiddushin chuppah, but the Bala Itor, again, right where I was in the home territory of the Bala Itor. He was the Provençal Yid. He says he also says chuppah v'kiddushin. He has our version chuppah v'kiddushin, and he says chuppah through the kiddushin that came before it. So Gemara says, and so somebody says that the opinion that says not to conclude this blessing with Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael Dei Chuppah V'Kedushin, he would say because he says the Berachas Erusin, this blessing is similar to like a blessing before you make a blessing on fruit or a blessing on mitzvah, like for example on Shlita, where the rabbis did not institute that you require a conclusion to the blessing, because those are short blessings and they're just giving thanks to God and you don't make a request. And so therefore that's like the Berachas Erusin. Since there's no interruption for a request, it's all praise. You don't need to recite a blessing at the end. And the one who concludes the blessing with Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael Kedusha, because he says that the blessing of the betrothal has the word Kedusha, has holiness in it. And so therefore it's like a blessing of Kiddush Hayom like we do on Friday nights. And so therefore we have to conclude it with a Berachas of Kiddush. So we learned the rabbis say make the blessing of the chasanim, the Sheva brachos, all 7 days. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda Yehuda says that's where you have new faces appearing. Every day you have a new face that was appearing, which wasn't there before. Could they not do they require them that they weren't there for any of what was there the day before? Maybe they weren't there for the chuppah, maybe they weren't there for the blessings, maybe they weren't there for the whole wedding. So this is a discussion amongst the commentaries. All right, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I will be happy to address.